Welcome to the Riverwood Conservancy's webinar, Earthquakes and Volcanoes of New Zealand. Welcome. My name is Stephanie Keeler and I am the Community Program Coordinator at the Riverwood Conservancy. I hope you are all doing well and staying safe. Before we get to today's presentation, we have a couple housekeeping notes. The next couple of weeks are all about turtles. So this week we have 3 free webinar sessions featuring a presentation about turtles, a meet and greet with our 5 turtle pets, and as well as a craft. So join us for one or all of these sessions to ask all of your turtle questions. The program is focused for families and primary students, but all are welcome to join us. We have plenty of other upcoming webinars, so please visit our website for more information. A special thanks to Credit Valley Conservation for making these programs possible. If you have the financial means today to support our programming, please give at the riverwoodconservancy.org. And today we have our wonderful Barbara Murck again, back for another wonderful presentation. Barbara completed her undergraduate degree at Princeton University and her graduate degree in geology at University of Toronto. For the past 10 years, Professor Murck has co-taught a field course in Ecuador for the University of Toronto's Summer Abroad program, which these students spend 1 month in the field studying geology, ecology, environmental science, and international development. Professor Murck is the author of several textbooks on geology and environmental science. She's an award-winning lecturer and was the recipient of the University of Toronto's President's Teaching Award in 2010. So she is a wonderful presenter and I'm so excited to have her back today. If you have any questions for Dr. Murck, please type them in Q&A tab in Zoom. And for those watching on Facebook, I will try to get to them as well. So I will turn things over to Barbara now. Thank you so much for joining us, Barbara, and thank you everyone in the chat as well.
Great, thanks a lot, Stephanie. Am I sharing okay and you're hearing me okay and all that? Okay, good. And I'm just going to apologize in advance if I freeze up when I'm having kind of wonky internet, but I think we're sort of all familiar with that. And if I do freeze, I should be back in 20 seconds or so. So thanks a lot for having me. I'm here to talk about the earthquakes and volcanoes of Aotearoa, or New Zealand. We need to talk a little bit about the geology because I have to tell you why there's earthquakes and volcanoes there. I'm not going to really spend any time introducing myself because Stephanie already gave that nice introduction. Just to say that I am a professor at the University of Toronto Mississauga, right around the corner from Riverwood. We've had a long and productive relationship for many, many years. And I am also a hiker, as you can see here. This is my hiking buddies, the Lost Trio Hiking Association. This one is the first time that we did the Bruce Trail. This is with our bottle of champagne at the halfway mark. So I want to tell you what the plan is for this time. I'd like to talk a little bit about the geology of New Zealand, as I said, just so we can talk about why New Zealand is so geologically active. And then we'll focus on the earthquakes and volcanoes of New Zealand. I'm not really going to talk much about the animals, but I just wanted to mention a couple of quick things for those who were at the first Galapagos talk that I did a few weeks ago. And remember, we talked about some of the odd characteristics of island biota. And somebody actually asked, is the same true of other islands like New Zealand? And in fact, it is. All those characteristics that we talked about, the high amount of endemism, the really unique innovations, the adaptive radiation, the flightless birds, for example, that we saw in Galapagos, and of course you also see them in New Zealand as well. So I just thought I would mention that's kind of an interesting thing about islands. So let's talk a little bit about the geology of New Zealand and why is New Zealand so geologically active? It's an absolutely beautiful country. Beautiful, beautiful country. If you haven't been, I really recommend that you go. I was actually there just a year ago. We got back 1 week before everything hit the fan. And I was there as a resource person for the University of Toronto Alumni Travel. And it's just a fantastic place to visit. I know it seems far away, but it's really worthwhile. So let's have a little look at the geology here. So these are the two islands that make up New Zealand, the North Island here, South Island here, the three biggest cities, Christchurch, Wellington, and Auckland. And here is a satellite image of the two islands. Here's that sort of forked end right here of the South Island. And this is part of the North Island. So north in this image is over in that direction. Let's look a little bit more closely at these islands and what is actually their geological setting. So it turns out that the two islands that we know as New Zealand, the two visible islands, are actually part of a much larger body called Zealandia. And Zealandia, it's been suspected for a long time, but only recently confirmed scientifically that it is a separate continent. So for a long time, it was thought, well, maybe New Zealand is sort of, they're just volcanoes, that it's not really a continent, and maybe they're sort of part of Australia. And now it's known that actually the main publication was this one by Mortimer and colleagues in 2017, Zealandia, Earth's Hidden Continent, in which they confirmed it is a continent. So most of the continent actually is hidden underwater. Only about 6% of it is poking its head up above the water, and that's what we see as the two islands of New Zealand. So how do we know all of this, and how do we know if we should be calling it a continent or should we be calling it something else? And importantly, what does this have to do with New Zealand being geologically active? So here we have, of course, Australia. And you can see something interesting about Australia, which is that it has this sort of edge around it. And here is that edge. And let's sort of go back, and you can sort of see that there's a part of Australia that's sort of just offshore from what we know as the continent of Australia, that seems like it's sort of sitting a little bit higher from the ocean floor around it. This is very typical of continents. It's true of North America, for example. And all of that surrounding edge that is underwater is still actually technically part of the continent. So you can think, for example, of the Grand Banks in Canada, our continental shelf. Technically, that is part of the continent. So now let's go over here, and here we have the North Island and the South Island. And you can kind of see that there's something a little bit fishy going on over here, again, with that, looks like some stuff that's standing up a little higher from the rest of the ocean floor. And indeed, that is the mass that has been identified as the continent of Zealandia. I'll just back that up again and show you where that is. So keep your eye on this little leg that sort of sticks out here as we move on to the next map. But I want to remind you again that only a very small portion of this continent is showing above water. All this other part of Zealandia is underwater. This continent of Australia is a little bit more typical, so more of it is showing and only a little bit is underwater. Zealandia is kind of the opposite. And so again, here's a map showing the same thing. This is the continent of Australia with its also part of its continent, but underwater. And then over here is New Zealand with its continent surrounding it. And this is that little leg that I said to keep your eye on here. So this, and you can see from the legend, this is all continental crust, the gray part. So what does that mean, actually? I've said that Zealandia is a continent. What do we actually mean by that? What is a continent? And how do we know that we should be referring to Zealandia as a continent? So it turns out that in the Earth, of course, is layered. We all know that. And the outermost layer is called the crust. And it turns out that there are two different types of crust. The first is called oceanic crust, which, not surprisingly, is the crust that underlies the ocean basins. And oceanic crust, you can see over here, is usually quite dark. It's mostly made of basalt, volcanic rock. It's usually quite young. Lots of the volcanic rock that makes up the oceanic crust is actually still forming as we speak, so brand new volcanic rock. It also tends to be quite thin as crust goes, and it's of pretty high density. In contrast, continents tend to be much lighter in color, and they're mostly made of the rock type granite and related rocks. The rocks that make up continents are much older, typically, hundreds of millions of years, even billions of years old, like the Canadian core of the Canadian continent. And they're not volcanic rocks, they're plutonic rocks that solidified and cooled deep under the ground. Continental crust tends to be quite thick and it's very low in density, so it's kind of lightweight. So continental crust tends to sort of ride around on things. Also, it stands, because it's low in density, it tends to stand up higher in elevation compared to the surrounding seafloor. So if we think about Zealandia, according to these characteristics, you can see pretty easily that Zealandia is a continent. It displays all the characteristics of continental crust. So here again is that outline. Here's that leg that sticks out right here. All the little squares here and dots are samples that they've collected, and they've analyzed the rock type, and they're all granite or related to granite. They've done age dating and they're all quite old. And this map also is showing topography, and all the lighter colors are standing topographically higher than the blue colors, which is the rest of the ocean floor. So basically, we can see that this is a continent, and we can call it that with some confidence. And importantly, it is a continent. It's not a tectonic plate. So what do I mean by that? Let's contrast tectonic plates with continents. Plates, as I'm sure most of you know, are huge fragments of the lithosphere, which is the crust plus the outermost part of the mantle. And they're huge brittle fragments, and they jostle around and move around because the inside of the earth is quite mobile. So these plates are sort of jostling around and moving around, and they are carrying the continents around on top of them. So for example, if we look at Australia, here is Australia, here is the continent of Australia that includes that light purple area. And that continent of Australia is riding happily around on a much larger tectonic plate, which is called, not too surprisingly, the Australian plate. So the plates are jostling around and they're carrying the continents on their backs. Again, not all that surprisingly, the boundaries between these plates, where they jostle against each other, tend to be areas of very intense geological activity. I mean, you're jostling around a plate the size of, North America or the Pacific Ocean, and it's banging up against another plate, you're going to have some geological activity. Well, let's look over here. This is New Zealand. So the dark gray is our South Island, North Island. And then this is Zealandia, the lighter gray part here. Well, look at where that's located. It's sitting right on a plate boundary. Here's the Australian plate, and this whole bit is the Pacific plate. And that continent of Zealandia, it's not just sitting on that plate boundary, it is like cut in half by that plate boundary. And if we look at that a little bit more closely, back at our previous map, here again is that boundary, here's that little leg that sticks out. And look at this. This is the plate boundary. This is the Pacific plate over here. This is the Australian plate over here. That plate boundary is cutting right through the continent of Zealandia. So we can anticipate that there's going to be some geological activity going on there. Let's look a little bit more closely at just this bit right here, which is, so the North Island is here and the South Island is more or less here. So let's zoom in on the islands and see what that plate boundary really means for us in terms of what's going on in the islands. And so here's that area here. Here's the North Island, South Island, and you can see that this plate boundary is marked by a whole bunch of faults that are cutting right across the island. Here's the Australian plate, here's the Pacific plate, and Zealandia and New Zealand are sitting right astride that plate boundary. And so the North Island and the top part of the South Island are sitting on one plate, and the rest of the South Island is sitting on a completely different plate. It's sitting on the Pacific plate. So that's, right there, we know that there's going to be some geological activity going on. But on top of that, this turns out to be a super complicated plate boundary. It is responsible for most of the topography of New Zealand, and it generates a lot of geological activity, including earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. And so let me show you what I mean by that. So zooming in now, this is sort of the bottom half of the South Island. South Island sort of ends right about here, and then the North Island's off in that direction. And here again is the Australian plate and the Pacific plate. And it is cut by this plate boundary, where the plate boundary goes sort of through the middle of the North Island. So remember that South Island. Remember that this part of the South Island and the North Island are sitting over on this plate. And then this part of the South Island is sitting on a completely different plate, the Pacific plate. Where that boundary cuts across the South Island, it's referred to as the Alpine Fault. And I mentioned that it's responsible for much of the topography of New Zealand. So this is a picture taken right around here, looking north along this fault. And what you can see is all this sort of low-lying area right here, and the ocean is right here. So this is all this low-lying area here. And you can see off to the right are these very high mountains. They're called the Southern Alps. And this is them right here. So if we go over to this photograph, that fault, the Alpine Fault, is cutting right across here. And on the right is the Southern Alps, and on the left is all this low-lying stuff and the ocean. So all this movement along the fault and movement along the plate boundary is largely responsible for creating the topography of New Zealand. I have a dog who's asking to come in. I might have to go and let him in a minute. So I mentioned that it's an unusually complicated plate boundary. And so here we have sort of 3D pictures showing this plate boundary. So here's the South Island. All this right here is the South Island, and here's the North Island. And so the plate boundary is sort of cutting right across the middle of this diagram. Australian plate is over here. Pacific plate is over here. So let's have a closer look at this. In the middle here, along that Alpine Fault, the plates are moving sideways past each other. You can see that it sort of shows it right here. And again, this part of the South Island is going that way. This part of the South Island is going that way. We call this a strike-slip fault. It's a horizontal movement. Now, if we go over here to the northern part of the islands and the northern part of where the plate boundary cuts across the islands, it's a completely different story. Here, the Pacific plate is actually going underneath the Australian plate. You can see that right here. So it's this kind of motion. So instead of being horizontal, moving past each other, they're going like this. And that's what's called a subduction zone. Now, if we come down here and look at the South Island, the southern part of the South Island, we see that it's also a subduction zone, but hang on a minute, it's going the other way. In this case, so see what I mean? You've got the arrows are going in a different direction. So in this case, the Australian plate is going underneath the Pacific plate. So, oh my goodness, it's a ridiculously complicated plate boundary. And the motion overall is actually kind of like, kind of like that. It's like at the north part, it's going this way, and then it's going past each other, and then it's going that way. Very complicated plate boundary. And this very complicated plate boundary creates the topography, creates the mountains, the valleys, the beautiful valleys, the glaciers, and earthquakes and volcanoes in New Zealand. And so what ends up happening here is that New Zealand and Zealandia are basically sitting here, here's Zealandia, sitting again right on this plate boundary between the Australian plate and the Pacific plate. And that is part of what we all know as the Pacific Ring of Fire. So that is the whole plate boundary surrounding the Pacific Ocean, which is a whole series of very active plate boundaries with a lot of earthquakes and a lot of volcanoes ringing the entire Pacific Ocean And look where it goes, right down the length of New Zealand. So let's look at some of the consequences of all of this action along that plate boundary. And let's start by looking at some of the earthquakes of New Zealand. I'm going to talk more about this particular earthquake that happened in 2011 in Christchurch. And this one was one that was a little bit later and had a lot of damage and was actually a higher magnitude, I think, but had way fewer casualties, Kaikoura earthquake. So before we get into that, what is actually an earthquake? So earthquakes occur, we've set up our situation where we've got these plates grinding past each other. They're either grinding past horizontally or they're grinding past more vertically in a subduction zone. And earthquakes occur when these huge blocks of rock are being moved around by these great tectonic forces and are trying to move past each other, but they become locked in place. Again, not that surprisingly, you're moving, plates the size of, the Pacific Ocean. So it's not going to move necessarily that easily as it tries to move past, say, the Australian plate. They become locked in place and they can't move past each other. And they're trying and trying and trying to move. And if that built up strain energy becomes too great, they slip past each other and the rock breaks along the fault and releases that pent up energy all at once. And that's what we experience as an earthquake. So all of those cracks and fractures and stuff that are marking that plate boundary and marking the place where the rocks are trying to move past each other, we of course refer to those as faults. They're huge, big fractures in the crust, in the lithosphere actually. And it turns out that New Zealand has many of them, not too surprisingly, because again, it's got that whole complex plate boundary cutting across the two islands. New Zealand has many, many active faults. Many earthquakes occur in New Zealand every single day. As in most parts of the world, most of them are too small to be noticed, but about 150 to 200 of them are large enough to be felt every year. So it is a very seismically active place. Most of these earthquakes, a few of them result from volcanic activity, but most of these earthquakes result from the plates, again, trying to push past each other, whether it's horizontally or vertically in a subduction zone. And this is a map showing just the major active faults in New Zealand. And so there's a lot, and you can see again, so down here is where that southern subduction zone is. And then we go through this alpine fault through the middle where the plates are moving past each other. And then up here into the subduction zone in the North Island, lots and lots of active faults. I mentioned that along some of these faults, the plates are trying to move past each other, and some of them are moving more vertically in the subduction zones. And that's what you see here. In the strike slip fault, they're just moving past each other. The earthquakes in a setting like this tend to be quite shallow. They're near the surface, but they can be really big. So two other examples of this type of geological environment that you're familiar with are the San Andreas Fault in California is of this type of environment. And also Haiti. The big earthquake in Haiti in 2010 was, generated along this type of plate boundary. So big, kind of shallow near the surface, but big. In contrast, in subduction zones, again, the one plate is riding underneath the other and one's riding over the other. And so you can see that we have a lot of potential here for generating quite deep-seated earthquakes. And in subduction zones, you can get earthquakes up to several hundred, even many hundreds of kilometers down inside the crust. And you have the potential for generating really great earthquakes, really big earthquakes. So this is what it translates into in New Zealand in terms of seismicity. Over on this map, we see shallow seismicity. So these are shallow earthquakes that are close to the surface. And you can see they're pretty much everywhere. We have them going through the middle part here along the Alpine Fault. We have them down here in this subduction zone in the south. and we have them up here in this subduction zone in the north. And if we look over here, we see only the deep-seated earthquakes. So interestingly, they're completely missing from the middle part here. Do you remember why? That's our alpine fault, where we just have that strike-slip motion, where it's just moving past each other. There's no mechanism really for generating deep earthquakes on that kind of fault. So down here we have deep earthquakes in this subduction zone, and then up here in this big subduction zone, we also have very deep-seated earthquakes, lots of them. So here is a map showing some of the historic earthquakes of New Zealand. I'll comment on a few of these, primarily the one in 1931 in Hawke's Bay. That was the biggest natural disaster in New Zealand history in terms of casualties. And then the one in Christchurch was second, I think, in terms of natural disasters in New Zealand. This map over here is a seismic hazard map. So the way these maps work is it shows probability that the ground acceleration will exceed a certain threshold within the next 50 years. And I find this map kind of interesting because look at it, you can just see that alpine fault cutting right through the South Island. So southern subduction zone, alpine fault, and up into the northern subduction zone at the top there. It's kind of interesting. So let's talk a little bit about some of these earthquakes. The 1931 Hawke's Bay earthquake on the North Island was, as I said, New Zealand's deadliest natural disaster, 256 deaths, magnitude 7.8. That's a big earthquake. It's not what we would call a great earthquake, but the earthquake scale is logarithmic. So that means that instead of going up one by one by one by one by one, you're going, as you go from 7.1 to 7.2 to 7.3, you're going up 10 by 10 by 10 by 10. So, going from a 7 to a 7.8, that's a really big difference. That's a much bigger earthquake. And they recorded almost 600 aftershocks from this earthquake. And there were as well some permanent landscape changes that resulted. The one that we're mostly familiar with that happened in 2011 was in Christchurch on the South Island. There were 185 deaths from this event, lots and lots and lots of structural damage. This is the Christchurch Cathedral, which is right in the middle of downtown and pretty much destroyed. It's taken them until like last year to decide whether they should fix it. And they have decided that they are going to fix it, and they're going to try to bring it back. But, it was really touch and go whether it was going to be worthwhile to try to fix it. This was actually a series of two earthquakes. One that was earlier than this one in 2011. This one was in, I think, December of 2011. The earlier one was actually bigger. It was a 7.1, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. But there were almost no deaths. I think there was maybe a small handful. But what happened in the earlier earthquake is that all these structures were weakened. So when the second earthquake, I don't think you could call it an aftershock because it was too many months afterwards. But when this second earthquake happened in December, it was December or October, something late in 2011, because all those buildings had been weakened in the first earthquake, there was a ton of collapsed buildings, collapsed infrastructure, and everything else. Oh, it says right here, magnitude 7.1. Well, there you go. So it was the year before in Canterbury, which is close by, they had this bigger earthquake, and that caused all this infrastructure to be weakened, which then collapsed in the Christchurch earthquake in 2011. And it had a bunch of other impacts, including that it generated a tsunami. So let me show you some of the impacts of this earthquake. So first, here's again is a picture of what's going on here. So here's our South Island. Down here is the subduction zone. In this part in the middle, this side is moving this way, and this side is moving this way with the arrows. Here's Christchurch on the east coast, and that's where this particular earthquake was centered, 6.3. And you can sort of see what was going on over here. So on the left, you see the CTV building before the earthquake in 2011. And on the right, this is it afterwards. This is where most of the deaths occurred in this earthquake. The building just sandwiched down on itself. It completely collapsed. And now across the street from where the CTV building was, there is an installation of, I forget how many, but something like 153 or 100, whatever it was. Most of the people who died in the earthquake were at the CTV building. And they now have that number of white chairs. This was meant to be a temporary installation. And I think they're going to find a home for it and have it become a permanent installation. It's very moving to drive by and see it. And one of the interesting things that I found in Christchurch, it's taken them a long time. You know, this was 10 years ago almost, this earthquake. And this is what it still looks like. There's a lot of places in downtown Christchurch where you can still see a lot of the earthquake damage. And you can go on a tour and they'll show you, you know, this is where this building collapsed and this is where that building collapsed. And you still see, you know, things holding buildings up, structures that are weakened and that kind of thing. But I want to say that the city has a really good spirit in terms of rebuilding, and they're taking it slowly, but they're really focusing on, you know, building back better and building back, you know, a city that they can really love and that they can really live with, and that really has a core of vitality. And I really admire that quite a lot. This is some more building damage from the Christchurch earthquake, but just extensive everywhere throughout the downtown. And this is a really interesting one. So on the left is a suburb. It's not even a suburb, it's Perry, or right next to the downtown core, where you can see all these homes and everything. On the left, I guess, anyway, on this side, I'm kind of backwards here, you can see all these homes and everything else. And this is what it looks like now. And they have reached a decision to not rebuild all this stuff. It doesn't really have anything to do with being worried about earthquakes or anything like that. It's more that they've embraced what happened and what happened to people and what happened to people's homes. And they also have embraced what this land has become. So this picture is a little bit old. The area now is quite a bit more forested. And it's become a park that is very, very heavily used. And people, you know, so they've just embraced this as parkland. But it's very interesting because you can go on tours here, and as you drive along the streets, they're saying, you know, there's a driveway, there's a driveway, there's a driveway, there's a driveway. And you're going past where all these homes were located that absolutely collapsed in the earthquake. This was a little bit farther afield in Red Cliffs, and this destruction was actually caused not directly by the earthquake, but this was by a rock slide that was triggered by the earthquake in the hills outside of Christchurch. And the other thing that happened during the Christchurch earthquake that's kind of interesting is called liquefaction. So liquefaction sounds like there should be a lot of liquid involved, like you're adding liquid to the ground or something like that. And that isn't exactly what it is. When you have sediment or soil, it has particles, and the particles are held by friction where they're touching. And so that's what gives the ground, you know, its sort of firmness, its strength, and we build on it and everything else. So when you have an earthquake, what can happen is that the particles start to shake and they can lose contact with each other. And so the ground material can begin to behave like a liquid and flow, and sometimes liquid bubbles up from below. But this is occurring without any liquid being added. It's strictly that they've lost their frictional contact and they've lost their coherence. So now the material is behaving more like a liquid and perhaps allowing liquid to bubble up from underneath. So this kind of thing was quite widespread after the Christchurch earthquake. Another thing that happened was fairly far away. I mean, Christchurch is, sort of way off over to that side of this satellite image. So this is a satellite image showing the Tasman Glacier up here. And the earthquake actually generated a tsunami in the lake. So this is the glaciers here. These are lateral moraines and terminal moraine that's been deposited by the glaciers. And it caused a sort of mini tsunami. I don't know how many it was actually in this lake, and caused icebergs to calve off from the end of the Tasman Glacier, and they were carried all the way across. So all of these are icebergs that were broken off from the end of the glacier and carried to the end of the lake. So the other interesting thing I think about Christchurch and sort of New Zealand in general is that they're now retrofitting a lot of buildings. So seismic retrofitting. Oh, this, by the way, is the cathedral. So you can see that this is a more recent picture than the one I showed you before. So this is all shored up, the cathedral. They're starting to rebuild it. This is on the fencing that surrounds the cathedral. All will be well. And I really, to me, that's the spirit of Christchurch now, I think. So one thing that you see everywhere, all over Christchurch, but actually all over New Zealand, I think this picture I might have taken in Auckland, actually. And you see both external and internal seismic retrofitting. So what these are, you can see it easier on this picture because they're on the outside of the building. This is supports that have been added to this building to make it more earthquake proof. And these are actually movable joints. And so the idea is the building is flexible, and the building can sway during the earthquake, but it's got these braces. So the braces are supporting it and holding it up, but they're flexible. So they're going to allow the building to be not rigid. Rigid structures are not good in earthquakes because they break, right? So you want something that can flex but not fall down. And so that's the idea of adding these seismic retrofitting, is that you've got support now, but they're flexible so they can support the building. And you see these absolutely everywhere. As I said, I think this one is in Auckland, and this one is indoor inside the building in Christchurch. And once you start to notice them, they're all over the city. This is the art gallery in Christchurch. So this is a new building since the earthquake. And you might think, yikes, all that glass, but first of all, the building is spectacular and it's totally worth visiting if you're there. But the interesting thing about the art gallery is that it has a type of seismic earthquake proofing that is called a base isolator. And so the idea of a base isolator is, you've got the ground here, and then, you've got your building on top of the ground. So the ground is going to shake, and it's going to shake the building. So what a base isolator does is that it separates the building from the ground. So the ground can shake and the building won't shake. And there's a number of ways that you can do that. You can put, kind of like huge ball bearings underneath the building, and then the ground shakes and the building stays in place. And so this building is, as I said, a new building, and it was constructed with a base isolator, which is kind of super cool, I think. So let's go on to volcanoes, because I'm running out of time already. I want to tell you a little bit about the volcanoes of New Zealand, and then I want to, of course, focus on the eruption of White Island, which happened about 1.5 years ago. And again, we come back to our Pacific Ring of Fire. In this particular case, again, here's New Zealand right here, sitting right on that plate boundary. And all these red and orange and green and blue dots, those are all earthquakes. What's a little harder to see is the yellow dots, and the yellow dots are all volcanoes. So in addition to the earthquake activity, the Pacific Ring of Fire, it's called the Ring of Fire because it is the locus for a lot of active volcanoes, something like 400 active volcanoes that ring around the Pacific Ocean in this Ring of Fire. So what does that mean for New Zealand? First of all, what is a volcano? A volcano is a vent or a rupture in the crust through which magma, lava, rock, sometimes volcanic gases, and other types, volcanic ash, other types of volcanic materials are released to the surface. And there's lots of different mechanisms for volcanism that we don't really have time to go into. And the edifice of volcanic rock that builds up on that vent is what we see as the volcano. This one is Mount Taranaki, one of the most beautiful volcanoes, I think, in the world. New Zealand has some really interesting types of volcanoes. There's three main types: cone volcanoes and caldera volcanoes. These occur in those subduction zones, and hotspot volcanoes, which aren't related to the plate boundaries, and they just occur in isolated locations. I'll talk more about those in just a second. New Zealand also has lots of active volcanoes, which means doesn't mean that they're erupting right now, but it means they've erupted in recorded history. It has as well a bunch of dormant volcanoes, so ones that haven't erupted in quite a while, and then a bunch of extinct volcanoes as well that are not expected to erupt again, and another weird category called monogenetic volcanoes, which are volcanoes that erupt once and never again. And I have to admit, I don't know a huge amount about monogenetic volcanoes, but there are quite a few of them in New Zealand. So this is a map showing some of the famous volcanoes of New Zealand. This one is Taranaki, which I showed you a second ago. Here's White Island. We'll talk about it in just a minute. And you can see that, again, they're sort of scattered all around the islands. So our two types, the cone volcano and the caldera volcano, are both associated with subduction. So we have the one plate subducting underneath the other. So here's my test question for you. Is this referring to the North Island subduction zone or the South Island subduction zone? Playing the Jeopardy theme, we know this is in the north because here we have the Pacific plate subducting under the Australian plate. In the south, it's the other way around. And what happens is this plate is subducting down here and it gets down to great depth and it's hot down there. So it melts and it works its way back up to the surface as a cone volcano like Taranaki, or as a huge, volcanic field, let's call it, such as the Taupo volcanic zone, which is what my background actually is. And you can see over here some of the volcanoes of the North Island. Taranaki is there. Vakari or White Island is also a cone volcano, and Taupo volcanic zone is this type. The cone volcanoes are regular old subduction zone stratovolcanoes. They're sort of like, Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, Mount Fuji, very similar to those types of volcanoes. And Vakari, as I mentioned, White Island is of this type. Here's a picture of Taranaki again, one of the most beautiful volcanoes in the world. It's right up there in my top 5, I would say. Here's a picture of White Island. We'll come back to this one because the eruption itself was so interesting. And then the other type that's related to subduction is these huge volcanic fields that are enormous calderas, that are collapsed craters that have collapsed in on huge bodies of magma that underlie. So these are big deals. And the kinds of things that you often get with these volcanoes, so this is like Yellowstone or that kind of thing. So you get lots of hot springs and that kind of thing. And here's an example. This is the Taupo volcanic field that I showed you on the North Island and in my background as well. Huge collapsed caldera. So you can kind of get an idea from this. There's something hot going on under here. There's a huge magma body, huge collapsed crater on top of it, which we call a caldera. And obviously there's a lot of heat pretty close to the surface underneath this caldera volcano. And then the other type is what's called a hotspot volcano. So if you've been to Hawaii or the Galapagos Islands, or in fact Tahiti also, that's what type of volcano we have there, which is basically just a plume of hot material that's coming up from the mantle wherever. Doesn't have to be associated with a plate boundary. It's just poking its way up through the crust and making a volcano. So this is what we call Hawaiian type volcanism. Here's a couple of examples. This is in the North Island, Rangitoto Island. And this one is in the South Island near, or sorry, this is North Island as well, near Auckland, Browns Island. You can see just outside of Auckland, kind of a cool looking little volcano. And this one is near Dunedin. So this is the South Island. So again, these things pop up wherever. This is not even anywhere near the subduction zone. It's not even really that near the plate boundary, although everything in New Zealand is near plate boundaries. But this is just a hot spot that has poked up and made this volcanic cone, built this volcanic cone. So let's talk about the eruption of Whakaari, and also known as White Island. So it erupted about a year and a half ago. And it is one of those cone type volcanoes. And it sits over here just off the northeast edge, I guess, of the North Island. And White Island is privately owned, and the owners take tours out there. It is what we would call an active volcano. It was not dormant when it erupted in 2019, because look at all these are all very recent eruptions. You know, if a volcano doesn't erupt for 3 years, we still call it active. This is a very active volcano. It is a cone type volcano, which you recall I referred to as a stratovolcano. It's a sort of like garden variety. So strata are layers. So it's got layers of volcanic material and pyroclastics and, you know, ash and all kinds of stuff that have built into this steep cone. So it's similar to, you know, Mount Fuji, Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier. We can expect this to erupt fairly explosively, okay? And they tend to be, they're very steep-sided, you know, a classic cone-shaped thing. Now, in addition, Whakaari, of course, is a volcanic island. So it's in the water. Most of it is underwater. And that led to the eruption of 2019, which was what we refer to as a phreatic or phreatomagmatic eruption. And when you have this word in here, phreatic, it means that there was steam involved. So steam tends to make the whole thing a lot more explosive, because water has crept into the magma chamber under the volcano, and it's, you know, expanding, and it's going to really enhance the explosiveness of that eruption. I've got here that 20 people were killed. I actually think it's gone up now to 22, and they haven't been able to recover all the bodies as of yet, and they probably won't. So I mentioned that White Island is privately owned, and they take tours. That does not release them from the responsibility of, you know, providing safe tours for people and safe working environment and stuff. So they have been charged by the New Zealand government. They're going to be fined probably quite a lot of money, I think. It'll be in litigation for a while, I'm sure. There's very active volcano monitoring in New Zealand. And on White Island in particular, they had all kinds of stuff. They had webcams, they had seismographs, you know, measuring any kind of rumbling of the magma. They had microphones measuring the acoustic, you know, what's going on acoustically in the magma chamber. They had water testing, gas testing, soil testing. They were measuring whether the ground was bowing up. And before the eruption, they were at a level 2, so the highest level of unrest prior to going into an eruptive phase. So, like, I don't know about you, but I probably wouldn't have been bringing tourists to the island at that point. I don't know, you know, that's just me. But there were 47 some people, something like that, on the island when it erupted. This is what is meant by a phreatic or phreatomagmatic eruption. So the water seeps in, turns into steam, and makes the whole thing more explosive. So this is White Island after the eruption of 2013. You can see volcanic island. So most of the volcano is underwater. This is White Island 1 minute before the eruption in 2019. This is from a webcam. And what you see right here, all these little dots, they're people. So they're in the crater. They're in the volcanic crater at this time. And this is 1 minute before the eruption. So kind of gives you an idea of the scale of this thing and why everyone who was on the island was injured and 20 some people were killed. This one is a couple minutes later when the eruption was underway. So this was not a minor eruption. It caused, you know, it was a pretty significant eruption. As I said, you know, I think it's in litigation and it will be for a while. And oh my goodness, I'm really good. I'm ending again right on time. And I want to end with this beautiful picture by saying, look, we've talked about all this scary stuff, earthquakes and volcanoes and, you know, all that kind of thing. New Zealand is a ridiculously beautiful country. It is really, really worth going. The people are fantastic. The cities, I would live in Churchill, even though the earthquake and everything else. I love the city. I love the country. I really recommend going there. And kia ora means thank you in Maori, and I'm happy to take any questions. Steph, do you want to moderate questions, or how do you want to do that?
Yeah, absolutely, Barbara. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation, and you are getting so much great feedback in the comments right now. Somebody actually said I could listen for another hour or two. So much to learn. So
I could talk for another hour. Trust me.
I know you could. It was wonderful, and you ended right on time once again. I don't know how you do it. So we are getting some questions in. You can either type them in the chat or in Q&A. If you are,
just gonna let my dog out. Keep talking.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'll give the spiel. If you are typing in the regular chat, make sure that you're sending it to panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your questions. As well, if you're watching on Facebook, I will look over there too. Okay, so first question for you, Barbara. Were the North and South Islands attached at one point?
I mean, they are attached. They're attached by the underlying continent. So it's not a matter of whether they're attached to each other. It's a matter of which parts of the continent are poking up above the water level. I don't know if there's ever been I forget. I believe that more of the continent was poking up above the water, but we're talking 10 million years ago or something like that. And it's gone up and down for various reasons. So I'm going to say yes, but a long time ago.
Okay, awesome. I believe it's Emad who's asking, hi, can you elaborate again, please, on the phenomenon of liquefying the sand as a result of the earthquake? A question that I had seen come up too is that does that only occur when there is an earthquake, or are there other natural kind of occurrences that cause that?
There are other types of things. So it's pretty common in earthquakes. Like this is a big concern in San Francisco, because in San Francisco Bay, they have landfill. And so there's a big concern that, you know, all those buildings built on landfill and you know, and if it starts to shake. So if you think about quartz grains, for example, sand, they're round and hard and they're butting up against each other and they're frictionally locked together. So if you then start to shake them, they can lose contact with each other and then they can just move around wherever the heck they want. And so the material starts to behave like a liquid, and then liquid can bubble up. There was a famous case in Niigata, Japan, where they had an earthquake. Of course, lots of earthquakes in Japan. And this whole series of apartment buildings just like keeled over on their side because the ground underneath them liquefied. They weren't even damaged. They just like this. And people, you know, were allowed to walk up the side of the building and lower themselves into their apartments to get their stuff out. I mean, pretty crazy. But there are other places, like there are some areas. In fact, this just happened earlier this year in Norway, where they have a type of clay that's very subject to liquefaction. So any kind of disturbance can cause it to turn into a liquid-like material.
Okay, thank you. Raul has asked, thoughts on how New Zealand will evolve in the coming millennia or millions of years. And I believe Raul might have been a past student of yours, Barbara.
Uh-oh. I mean, I thought that somebody might ask sort of where did it come from and how is it related to Australia? And I do have another entire lecture on sort of how the continents have all moved around and the plates have moved around in the past sort of 100 million years. And and it was attached to Australia at one point. And then if you look at one of those plate animations, you sort of see New Zealand sort of screaming off in the distance like this and separating itself from Australia. I mean, I noticed somebody else asked, is New Zealand going to be split apart by the plate boundary? To me, that's the likely outcome, because it's straddling this plate boundary, and it's a very active plate boundary. So that's the obvious next step, is that, you know, the Pacific plate's going to keep going that way, and the Australia plate's going to keep going that way, and the islands are going to get farther and farther apart, probably.
Okay. We're getting lots of questions in here, Barbara, so we'll take a couple more if you have some time.
Yeah.
Rebecca said, great presentation. We've seen the damage earthquakes can cause, especially with the Christchurch one, but in general, is the damage caused by volcanoes more or less critical than earthquakes in New Zealand? And are New Zealanders, or Kiwis, I believe they're called, used to volcanoes in general, given how active some of them are? Kind of two questions there.
I mean, I wouldn't say they're used to either earthquakes or volcanoes. I mean, how do you get used to it? You know, they are more used to earthquakes since the Christchurch one, because the last really bad one was in 1931. And in 1931, there was very little understanding about anything like seismic retrofitting or whatever. So since 2011, the seismic retrofitting is now popping up all over the place. And engineers are pretty good now at engineering buildings, especially new builds, but even the older buildings, going around and adding those flexible joints and all that kind of thing. So they're taking the steps that they need to take to make buildings more earthquake proof. Volcanoes, you know, nothing we can do about them. They are where they want to be, and they aren't going to listen to us under any circumstance. So all you can do with volcanoes is just monitor them and pay attention to them, which is why I'm a little bit finger waggy about the owners of White Island. You know, they had it at the highest level of unrest prior to going into an eruptive phase, and they've been charged. You know, I'm not talking about sued. They've been charged criminally by the government of New Zealand for not providing a safe work environment and not providing a safe environment for the tourists and stuff. So I kind of feel like, okay, you own a volcano, you know, like you could think about paying attention to all this monitoring that's going on. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, I don't know the details of exactly what happened, but seems like perhaps they could have been paying a little more attention to you know, what the monitoring was telling them. So that's, you know, there's nothing else you can do with volcanoes. Just, you know, you just got to watch them and have a plan, you know, have an evacuation plan and that kind of thing in place. Yeah. I don't know if that answered the question.
I think it did. No, that was wonderful. Everyone's saying thank you for answering your questions.
Oh, you're frozen and I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Hello?
I can't hear you, and it's probably on my end. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Barbara.
Maybe not.
Still can't hear me? Yes, we can.
Oh, now I can. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. We'll do two more questions, and then we'll leave before the Wi-Fi cuts out here. Vishal asked, how can a continent form on two different plates? I always believe that a continent is linked to an individual plate.
I mean, that's a really good question, actually. And in the case of this particular continent, I don't know, but consider that plates are really active. And, you know, they're moving around and they're joining together and they're splitting apart and they're moving past each other. And so for just for example, totally different geological setting, but think about the East African Rift. So here we have Africa sitting right there, and running right down past the Horn of Africa, there's a new plate boundary that the plates are splitting apart right there, creating the East African Rift, creating all those weird volcanoes, Kilimanjaro and all those volcanoes there. That's new. That's a new plate boundary that is widening, and it's going to take the Horn of Africa off in one direction and the rest of Africa off in another direction. So that's a different environment. That's a spreading environment rather than a moving past each other environment, but same idea. You had the continent of Africa. Now, the question of why does a plate boundary form where it does, that's a bigger question that a lot of geologists have thought about. You know, why would Africa start splitting apart in that particular location? And I would say the jury is still out on that, but that's the kind of thing that's happening. Yeah.
Wonderful. You're getting so many comments about great presentation and thank yous all around. Barbara, I think you have a request for your next presentation, actually. There's a lot of people that want to know about the creation of continents. I don't know.
That might be beyond me, but I can recommend somebody good for that one.
There's a lot of requests for that.
A couple of people have asked for the slides, and I can send you a PDF if that would be. I don't know how hard it is to share that with people, but
yeah, absolutely. And we also record all of our videos, so you can either go to the Riverwood Conservancy's Facebook page, and we'll be posting it there right after this. And tomorrow morning we'll have it up on our YouTube page as well. So follow both of those accounts if you ever want to watch.
Rahul. Yeah, that's probably a better way to go. Too hard to distribute to people, but the recording is the way to go.
Exactly.
Thank you for coming, Rahul.
So I think that's all we have time for tonight. I want to thank you, Professor Murck, so much. You did a phenomenal job, such a great presenter, and so informative. And like somebody else said, we could just sit here for hours and listen to you, but we don't all have that much time. So thank you once again. Thank you everyone for coming. Once again, if you have any financial means to support the Riverwood Conservancy at all, please go to the riverwoodconservancy.org. We would greatly appreciate it. And check out all of our other programs upcoming this month. Thanks for joining us again today. Thank you, Barbara. And we will see you all soon. Have a good evening.